The air in the grand archive of Sector 7 was a testament to manufactured purity, a sterile composition of recycled oxygen and chemical neutralizers designed to preserve paper, not people. It smelled of nothing, which to Detective Kalen Valerius was the most offensive scent of all. His senses, honed to a razor's edge by genetics and brutal training, were starved in this white-walled mausoleum. The silence was just as oppressive, a thick, sound-dampening blanket that smothered the echo of his own precisely measured footsteps on the polished chrome-steel floor. Light, cold, and blue-white from recessed ceiling panels bleached all color from the world, rendering everything in stark monochrome. It was a place where life came to be filed away, forgotten, a perfect place for a body. The victim, a mid-level archivist named Lyra Vance, lay near the central data conduit, a splash of organic chaos in the otherwise pristine order. Her designation was Beta, her life unremarkable, according to the preliminary file that had materialized on Kalen's datapad. Yet the nature of her death was anything but. It was quiet, precise, a single vibro-puncture at the base of the skull, efficient, professional, not a crime of passion, but an execution. Kalen crouched, his long black coat pooling around his boots. He did not look at the body yet. First, he listened to the space, to the hum of the climate control and the whisper of the servers. Then he inhaled. He filtered through the layers of artificiality, the ozone tang of the data conduit, the faint metallic residue of the cleaning drones, the dry, crisp scent of aged paper and ink. Beneath it all, there was the coppery spike of blood, already fading, and the acrid tang of residual fear pheromones, a scent common to all designations in the face of death. But there was something else, a ghost of a scent, so faint it was like trying to remember a forgotten melody. It was elusive, a thread of ozone and something wild, something like petrichor after a lightning strike on barren soil. It was wrong. It did not belong here. His gaze finally settled on the victim, but his focus was on the air around her, the disturbed energy, the lingering olfactory signature of the perpetrator. The official report would list no witnesses. The archive's security logs had been wiped for the 3-minute window of the murder. A ghost had committed this crime, but ghosts left traces, and Kalen was the city's foremost expert in hunting them. He rose, his movements fluid and economical, and turned to the row of workstations. Only one was occupied. A young man sat perfectly still, his back ramrod straight, hands resting on the dormant surface of his console. He hadn't moved since Kalen had entered. He was a statue carved from tension. Kalen approached, his steps making no sound now. He stopped behind the chair, a silent predator observing its quarry. The man's file identified him as Elian, another Beta archivist. Subject, designation, Beta, status, compliant, residence, Sector 7, habitation, Block 4, unremarkable, just like the victim. But as Kalen drew nearer, the ghost scent intensified, clinging to this man like a shroud. It was fear, yes, but a specific vintage of it, old, deep, and meticulously controlled. It was the terror of an animal that had learned to masquerade as stone to survive. And beneath the fear, buried so deep it was almost undetectable, was that other note. The scent of rain and lightning, the scent of something untamed. Kalen moved into the man's line of sight. Elian flinched, a microscopic tremor that a lesser observer would have missed. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were wide and fixed on the far wall, refusing to meet Kalen's. His face was pale, a canvas of suppressed emotion. His scent profile was a masterpiece of misdirection, a faint, neutral odor consistent with a low-grade beta, overlaid with the sharp, sterile scent of the archive itself. He smelled of paper and dust and compliance. It was a lie. A very, very good lie. Kalen leaned closer, invading the carefully maintained barbel of Elian's personal space. The air crackled with unspoken tension. He lowered his voice, a quiet resonance that could cut through steel. "You were here when it happened." It was not a question. Elian's throat worked, a slow, painful swallow. His gaze remained fixed ahead. "I was at my station. I heard nothing. I saw nothing." The words were recited, a pre-rehearsed shield. Each syllable was perfectly spaced, devoid of inflection. Kalen's lips thinned into a line that was not a smile. He inhaled again, slowly, deeply, tasting the air between them. The scent of controlled fear was a symphony now, sharp notes of adrenaline muted by a heavy bass line of sheer willpower. The other scent, the impossible one, pulsed faintly beneath it, a secret rhythm. "You don't have to see or hear," Kalen murmured, his voice a cold caress against Elian's ear. "I can smell your fear." Elian's composure finally fractured. A shudder racked his slender frame. His eyes snapped shut, his knuckles turning white where they gripped the edge of the console. He was a string pulled taut to the point of breaking. Kalen watched the reaction with a detached, clinical interest, but a strange current, something akin to recognition, stirred deep within his alpha core. He was a creature of logic, a hunter who relied on data and sensory input. This was merely data. The subject was frightened. Frightened people hid things. It was a simple equation. But it wasn't simple. The scent wasn't just fear. It was a complex tapestry of emotions Kalen had no names for. It smelled of caged things, of thunderstorms trapped in glass jars, of a grief so profound it had become a part of the subject's cellular structure. It was the most intricate, most compelling scent he had ever encountered. It was a mystery, and Kalen Valerius lived to solve mysteries. He, too, straightened up, the sudden distance leaving a vacuum in its wake. Elian drew in a ragged, silent breath. "We are not finished," Kalen stated, his voice returning to its official, impersonal tone. He turned and walked away, the echo of his footsteps once again swallowed by the oppressive silence of the archive. He did not look back, but he could feel the archivist's gaze on him now, a palpable weight. He could still smell him, the fear, and something more, something that promised to unravel not just this case, but the sterile, ordered world Kalen had built around himself. It was a dangerous scent, and it was calling to him. He was not just a detective. He was an alpha, and that scent was a challenge. It was a lock, and he was the key. The thought was illogical, a remnant of primal instinct he had long since mastered. He dismissed it, but the scent lingered. The world was scent. For Elian, this was the first and most terrifying truth. Since childhood, he had learned to navigate the currents of the city not by sight or sound, but by the olfactory data that saturated the air. He could smell the desperation rising from the lower sectors like a sour mist, the metallic arrogance of the enforcers in their patrol cruisers, the cloying, synthetic cheer piped into the public plazas. Most importantly, he had learned to smell of nothing himself. He had spent his life becoming a void, a blank space in the city's sensory landscape. His entire existence was a carefully constructed fortress of scent-dampening soaps, neutralizing dietary supplements, and, above all, a will of iron that could suffocate his own biology. He was a ghost long before the detective had used the word. He was not a beta. He was an omega, unregistered, unbonded, and living in mortal terror of discovery. The consortium did not tolerate anomalies. Omegas were catalogued at birth, their lives managed from the cradle to the grave for the stability of the genetic pool. An unregistered omega was a loose variable, a threat to the grand equation. They were taken to facilities for recalibration. No one ever returned from recalibration. His parents had known. They had been scent chemists, dissidents, who believed in a world before designations became destiny. They had taught him control, taught him to build his fortress wall by painstaking wall. They had created the suppressants that were now his daily communion, the bitter pills that muted the storm inside him. And then they had vanished, taken, recalibrated, leaving him with nothing but their knowledge and a hollowed-out space in his chest where a family used to be. The archive was his sanctuary. Its chemical sterility was a balm, a white noise that helped him maintain his olfactory silence. Here, among the dead thoughts and forgotten histories, he could almost believe he was what his files said he was. Alien, beta archivist, compliant, unremarkable. Then Lyra was killed, and the detective came. Detective Kalen Valerius. The name was a whisper of dread in the city's undercurrents. The alpha of alphas, the consortium's finest hunting dog, whose senses were said to be so acute he could smell a lie before it was spoken. Elian had felt his approach long before he saw him. A shift in the air pressure, a disturbance in the sterile equilibrium of the room. And then, the scent. It was overwhelming, a force of nature that crashed against his carefully constructed walls. It smelled of cold iron and ozone, of undisputed authority and a deep, chilling stillness, like the heart of a glacier. It was the scent of absolute control, of a power so immense it had no need for aggression. It simply was, and it stripped him bare. When Valerius had leaned in, when his low voice had vibrated through the air, Elian's fortress had crumbled. "I can smell your fear." The words had been a physical blow. For years, no one had smelled anything from him. He was a blank, a void. But this alpha had looked past the facade and scented the terrified creature cowering within. The effort to hold himself together, to not release a single betraying pheromone of distress, was monumental. It was like holding back the ocean with his bare hands. The blood roared in his ears, and the ghost of his true scent, the scent of rain and wild things, the scent he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade, threatened to break free. It was a scent of panic, but also of a desperate primal call for an alpha to notice, to protect. It was a biological betrayal he fought with every fiber of his being. After the detective left, Elian remained frozen for a long time, the silence of the archive pressing in on him. He was compromised. The detective's scent lingered, an invisible stain in the air, a constant reminder of his proximity to ruin. It clung to the back of his throat, a taste of iron and ice that made his own suppressed instincts stir with a terrifying mix of fear and something else, a resonance, a morbid curiosity. He had spent his life running from alphas, from the cloying, aggressive sense of dominance that permeated the city. But this was different. Valerius's scent wasn't aggressive. It was absolute. It didn't demand submission. It simply assumed it as the natural state of the universe. And some deep, traitorous part of him, the Omega he kept chained in the dungeons of his soul, had responded to that certainty. It was a terrifying thought. He finally forced his trembling limbs to move. He had to reinforce his defenses. He had to erase the cracks the detective had exposed. He made his way to the small, sterile washroom at the back of the archive. The mirror showed a stranger, a pale face, haunted eyes the color of a winter sea. A tremor in his hands he couldn't control. He stripped off his uniform tunic and scrubbed his skin raw with the harsh, scent-neutralizing soap until it was red and burning. He was trying to wash away the detective's lingering presence, but more than that, he was trying to wash away himself. He was not an Omega. He was not. He repeated the words like a mantra, a prayer to a god he didn't believe in. He was alien, archivist, beta, compliant. The lie was his shield, his armor, his everything. But as he stared at his own reflection in the cold, unforgiving chrome steel, he could see the truth in the frantic pulse at his throat. The hunting dog had caught his scent, and it would not stop until it had found the source. Fear was a cold, heavy thing in his gut, but beneath it, the ghost of something else stirred. The part of him that smelled of thunderstorms was tired of being caged. It was a flicker of defiance, small and fragile, but it was there. The detective had smelled his fear, but he had also smelled him. And for the first time in a decade, Elian felt a terrifying, exhilarating pulse of what it might mean to be truly seen. The thought was madness. It was a death sentence. He had to bury it. He had to be a ghost again. He had to be nothing. He finished his ritual, reapplied the thin layer of scent-dampening lotion, and put his uniform back on. The armor was back in place, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was no longer strong enough. The interrogation room was a cube of grey synth concrete, furnished with a single steel table and 2 chairs. It was designed to be devoid of sensory comfort, a vacuum where the truth could be extracted without distraction. Kalen sat opposite Elian, a data pad glowing softly on the table between them. The air was thick with the archivist's meticulously controlled fear, a scent Kalen was beginning to find as familiar as his own. It was a testament to the man's discipline. Any other unregistered Omega would have flooded the room with distress pheromones by now. Elian, however, was a fortress, and Kalen found himself methodically testing its walls, searching for the slightest crack. "Your work records indicate you were Lyra Vance's direct subordinate," Kalen began, his voice flat, emotionless. "You catalogued her acquisitions for the restricted historical archives. Is that correct?" Elian gave a stiff nod, his eyes fixed on a point just over Kalen's left shoulder. "Yes, detective. Describe your professional relationship." "It was formal. She was my supervisor. She assigned my tasks. I completed them." The answers were clipped, precise, as if read from a script. Elian's hands were clasped in his lap, hidden beneath the table, but Kalen could see the tension in his forearms, the rigid set of his shoulders. "And your personal relationship?" "We did not have one." A lie, faint but detectable, a subtle shift in Elian's scent, a spike of something bitter, like burnt sugar, cutting through the fear. It was grief. Kalen filed the information away. Archivist Vance was flagged 2 months ago for accessing sealed files pertaining to Project Chimera. The access request was routed through your terminal. Can you explain that? Elian's composure wavered, a flicker of raw panic in his stormy eyes before the mask slammed back down. His scent soured for a bare second. I cannot. Supervisor Vance occasionally used my terminal when hers was undergoing diagnostics. She must have done so then. I was not aware of the specific files she was accessing. It was a plausible explanation. It was also another lie. Kalen let the silence stretch, a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. The quiet in the small room became a crushing weight. He watched Elian, watched the pulse beating frantically at the base of his throat, a tiny, terrified bird trapped in a cage of pale skin. He could feel the archivist's struggle, the immense effort of will it took to remain still, to not betray himself with a scent or a tremor. Part of him, the cold, analytical detective, admired the control. It was extraordinary. Another part, the primal alpha core he so rigorously suppressed, felt a disquieting pull. It wasn't the urge to dominate, to break this creature down as he had so many others. It was something else, a strange, unwelcome instinct to shield, to draw the tension out of those shoulders and quiet the frantic beat of that pulse. The thought was so alien, so contrary to his function, that he immediately dismissed it as a biological anomaly. Elian's unique scent was clearly having a minor disruptive effect on his own system. He would need to file a report with the medtechs for a system diagnostic after the case was closed. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze finally pinning Elian's. The archivist flinched but held his ground, his sea-grey eyes a maelstrom of contained emotion. "Project Chimera," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur, was a Black-level consortium initiative from 2 decades ago. It focused on the amplification and weaponization of Omega pheromones, specifically on a rare genetic marker that produced what they called a resonant effect, the ability to influence alpha emotional states. The project was officially decommissioned. All test subjects were listed as terminated. All research data was sealed. He watched Elian's face for a reaction. Nothing. The man's control was absolute. But his scent was screaming. The notes of rain and lightning, the untamed thing Kalen had scented from the very beginning, were surging against the walls of their cage, desperate to break free. It was a scent of pure, undiluted terror, but also of a fierce, defiant life. It was the scent of a survivor. The files Lyra Vance accessed, Kalen continued, pressing his advantage, contained the original subject data, genetic sequences, family lines. Tell me, archivist, why would a mid-level beta be interested in the lineage of terminated Omega test subjects? Elian's breath hitched. His carefully constructed walls were beginning to show hairline fractures. He looked down at the table, at his own hands, which he had finally brought into view. They were trembling. "I don't know," he whispered, the sound raw. "You're lying." The words were soft, yet they landed with the force of a physical blow. Elian looked up, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears, a look of profound despair on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Kalen felt it again, that illogical, primal urge. The scent of Alien's despair was a physical thing in the room, a sharp, aching fragrance that bypassed his analytical mind and struck something deeper. He had a sudden, vivid image of shielding Elian with his own body, of placing himself between the archivist and the cold, grey world that was closing in on him. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The moment was broken. "The interrogation is over," he said, his voice hard, a shield against his own internal confusion. "You are confined to your quarters until further notice. Do not attempt to contact anyone." He turned and left the room without a backward glance, the heavy steel door sliding shut behind him with a definitive hiss. He stood in the sterile corridor, the silence rushing back in. He could still smell Elian's terror and grief on his clothes, on his skin. He was an enforcer, a tool of the system. His purpose was to identify threats and neutralize them. Elian was a threat, an anomaly, an unregistered Omega, likely with the resonant genetic marker the consortium had tried to bury 2 decades ago. His duty was clear. He should report his findings, and Elian would be taken for recalibration. It was the logical, efficient solution. But as he walked down the long, white corridor, the scent of thunderstorms and caged wild things followed him. And for the first time in his decorated career, Detective Kalen Valerius hesitated. The equation was no longer simple. There was a variable he hadn't accounted for, and it smelled like rain. The confinement of his small habitation pod was both a prison and a strange comfort. It was a box, barely large enough for a sleep couch and a small sanitation unit, but it was his box. The air was filtered through his own system, scented with his own brand of Null soap and the faint, dusty smell of the few physical books he was allowed to keep. It was a space he could control, but control was a memory now, a distant shore he could no longer reach. The detective's scent, the ghost of iron and ice, had followed him here. It was embedded in the fibers of his uniform, a phantom presence in the small, enclosed space. It was a constant, unnerving reminder of how thoroughly his defenses had been breached. His meticulously constructed world was dissolving around him. Lyra was gone. His secret was compromised, and he was trapped. Panic was a living thing, a cold serpent coiling in his gut. He paced the length of the pod, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, the movements sharp and agitated. He had to do something. He couldn't just wait for them to come for him. The detective knew. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. Project Chimera. The words echoed in his mind, a death knell. His parents had been part of the research team, not as subjects, but as scientists, before they saw the horrific reality of what the consortium was doing. They had tried to leak the data, to expose the project. They had failed, and the consortium had made an example of them. They had taken his parents, but they had missed him. A clerical error, a data ghost. He was the living legacy of their failure, the last remnant of a project meant to be erased from history. Lyra had known. She had been his mother's friend, a fellow dissident playing the long game from within the system. She had been searching the archives for years, looking for a way to get him out, to find a weakness in the consortium's armor. She had been using his terminal to search for Project Chimera, not to expose him, but to find the names of other survivors, other allies. And now, she was dead. They had killed her to get to him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, sinking onto the edge of the sleep couch. It wasn't random. It wasn't just a silencing. It was a message. They were closing the loop. Grief, sharp and suffocating, tore through him. Lyra, with her quiet smiles and secret, knowing glances. She had been the only link to his past, the only person who knew him as more than a file number, and he had led them to her. His existence had been her death sentence. A dry, racking sob escaped his lips, the first sound he had made since leaving the interrogation room. The serpent of panic in his gut tightened its coils. His control, already fractured, began to shatter. A tremor ran through him, starting deep in his bones. The air in the pod grew thick, heavy. A faint, sweet scent began to bleed from his skin, the smell of ozone and blooming nightshade. His suppressants were failing. Years of disciplined denial were being overwhelmed by the sheer force of his terror and grief. He could feel his own biology rising up to betray him, the dormant omega instincts stirring in response to the recent, potent exposure to a dominant alpha. The detective had not only scented his fear, he had awakened the very thing Elian had tried to kill within himself. He scrambled for his personal medkit, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlatch it. Inside, beneath a false bottom, was a small, lead-lined case. It contained a single, emergency-grade suppressant injector. His parents had synthesized it for him, a last resort. It was brutally effective, but had severe neurological side effects. Using it meant risking memory fragmentation, nerve damage. It was a choice between a possible death and a certain one. He fumbled with the injector, the needle glinting in the pod's dim light. His skin was slick with a cold sweat, and the scent in the air was growing stronger, sweeter. It was a scent of distress, a pheromonal scream for help that would be an undeniable beacon to any alpha within range. It was the scent of his own execution. He pressed the injector to his thigh, the hiss of the compressed gas a sharp counterpoint to the ragged sound of his own breathing. A burning cold spread through his veins, a chemical fire extinguishing a biological one. The scent in the room began to recede, the sweetness curdling and then fading into nothingness. The tremors subsided, replaced by a deep, aching cold. The serpent of panic uncoiled, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. He had bought himself time, but he knew it was a temporary fix. The detective had lit a fuse, and the emergency suppressant had only slowed its burn. He had one chance, one contact. An old friend of his parents, a man who ran a smuggling ring out of the undertunnels, a ghost in the system named Jax. Lyra had given him the contact protocol for emergencies. This was an emergency. Accessing the network was a risk. The consortium monitored everything, but staying here was a greater one. He moved to the small interface embedded in the wall of his pod. He couldn't use the standard network, but his parents had built a back door, a ghost channel hidden within the pod's maintenance code. It was a desperate gamble. He took a deep breath, the air now blessedly neutral again, and began to type. His fingers moved with a newfound steadiness, the cold fire of the suppressant lending him a strange, brittle clarity. He was no longer just a frightened archivist. He was the son of dissidents. He was the last subject of Project Chimera. He was a loose variable in the consortium's perfect equation, and he would not be erased without a fight. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his stomach, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sliver of his parents' defiance, a spark of Lyra's quiet courage. The detective had been wrong. He couldn't just smell fear. He had smelled a storm, and the storm was just beginning to break. Kalen stood before the vast, floor-to-ceiling window of his apartment in the spire, the glittering, ordered expanse of Sector 7 spread out below him. The city was a circuit board of light and shadow, a monument to control and efficiency. It was his city. He was its guardian, its immune system, tasked with identifying and purging its infections. For his entire career, this view had brought him a sense of cold satisfaction. It was the physical manifestation of the logic and order he embodied. Tonight, it felt like a cage. The interrogation with Elian replayed in his mind, a continuous, looping data stream. The archivist's rigid posture, the storm in his eyes, the lies that were so technically proficient yet emotionally transparent. And the scent. Always the scent. It clung to his memory, a complex code he couldn't decipher. He had spent hours reviewing the case files, cross-referencing data points, searching for a logical path forward. The evidence was clear. Lyra Vance was a dissident. She was investigating Project Chimera. She was murdered by an unknown party to silence her. Elian was her accomplice, and more than that, he was the living, breathing secret she was trying to protect. An unregistered, resonant Omega. A potential weapon of immense power, or a catastrophic liability. The protocol was unambiguous. He was required to report subject Elian for immediate detainment and assessment by the Consortium's Special Sciences Division. It was his duty. Failure to do so was treason. Yet he had not made the report. He had confined Elian to quarters, a temporary measure that bought him time he had no logical reason to need. He told himself he was waiting for more evidence, for a clearer picture of the conspiracy that had led to Vance's murder. He needed to identify the third party, the silent assassins who had breached the archive's security. Detaining Elian now could alert them, drive them deeper into hiding. It was a sound, tactical reason. It was also a lie he told himself to justify the profound sense of wrongness that settled in his gut whenever he pictured Elian in the sterile confines of a special sciences lab. He closed his eyes, accessing his own internal archives, replaying the sensory data from the interrogation, the spike of bitter grief when he'd asked about Elian's personal relationship with Vance, the sour tang of panic when he'd mentioned Project Chimera, and beneath it all, that constant, maddening thrum of thunderstorms and wild earth. It was a scent that spoke of a life lived under immense pressure, of a spirit that refused to be broken. It was a scent that, for reasons his logic could not process, resonated with a part of himself he kept locked away, the primal alpha, the part that understood instinct, territory, and protection. This was the anomaly, not Elian, but his own reaction to him. He had interrogated dozens of Omegas over the years, registered and otherwise. He had smelled their fear, their defiance, their despair. It was all just data, pheromonal signals to be catalogued and analyzed. But Elian's scent, it bypassed the analyst. It spoke directly to the alpha, and it didn't trigger the instinct to dominate or possess. It triggered something far more dangerous. Empathy. He turned from the window and moved to his workstation. He pulled up the files on Lyra Vance again, but this time he looked deeper, searching not for her crimes, but for her network. Dissidence didn't work alone. He cross-referenced her encrypted communications, flagging keywords, searching for patterns. Chimera was one, another was Jax, and a third, recurring term, sanctuary. The search led him to a series of heavily encrypted data packets buried in the city's grey market networks. They were shielded by code he recognized, the distinct, elegant signature of Elian's parents, Aro and Lena Miar, the brilliant scent chemists who had vanished 17 years ago. They had been trying to build a new life, a safe haven for those the Consortium deemed imperfect, a sanctuary. He followed the trail, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He bypassed firewalls and sliced through security protocols with an ease that would have seen any other citizen sentenced to recalibration. He was the system's hunter. He knew all its secret paths. The trail led him to a disturbing conclusion. The hit on Lyra Vance was not sanctioned by the High Council of the Consortium. The security wipe, the precision of the kill. It was internal, but it was off the books, a ghost entity operating within the system. He cross-referenced the timing of the murder with personnel movements within the spire. A name emerged. Director Valerius, his own father, the head of the Special Sciences Division, the man who had overseen the original Project Chimera, the man who had signed the termination orders for all its subjects, the man who had groomed Kalen to be the perfect, unfeeling enforcer. The logic was cold, brutal, and inescapable. His father was cleaning up loose ends. He had discovered the existence of a surviving subject, Elian, and was moving to acquire his asset. Lyra Vance had been an obstacle. Kalen was meant to be the tool of retrieval, the hunting dog sent to flush the prey, unaware that his own master was the true predator. The realization landed not with a crash, but with a quiet, sickening click, like a final gear locking into place. His entire life, his entire purpose, had been a manipulation. He was not a guardian of order. He was the gilded leash for his father's ambition. He looked at his own reflection in the dark screen of the console. The calm, controlled face of the city's top detective stared back at him. But for the first time, he saw the strings. He saw the cage. He felt a sudden, visceral need for air. He left his apartment and took the grav lift down, not to the pristine upper levels, but deep into the underbelly of the spire, to the evidence lockup. He needed to see something, to confirm a suspicion that had been gnawing at him. He retrieved the personal effects of Lyra Vance. Among them was a small, antique silver locket. It was empty, but when he held it to his nose, he could detect the faintest trace of a scent. It wasn't Lyra's. It was the scent of thunderstorms, Elian's scent. She had carried it with her, a memento, a promise. Kalen stood alone in the cold, silent lockup, the locket in his hand. The equation had been solved. Elian was not the threat, he was the target, and Kalen was the weapon being aimed at him. A profound, glacial rage began to build within him. It was not the hot, explosive fury of a lesser alpha. It was a cold, focused anger, the kind that could reshape landscapes. He had been used. He had been lied to. His purpose had been corrupted. He made a decision. It was illogical. It was treason. It was the only choice he had left. He would not be his father's weapon. He would not hand Elian over. He would become a shield. He left the lockup and headed back towards Sector 7. He was no longer going to the archive as a detective. He was going as something else entirely. He was going to find the storm, not to cage it, but to see if he could stand in the rain. The air in the Grand Archive was different this time. The sterile chemical purity was still there, but now it felt fragile, a thin veneer over something tense and watchful. Kalen moved through the silent rows of shelves, his senses on high alert. He was not here on official business. He had bypassed security, a ghost in the system he once served, his enforcer credentials granting him access while masking his true purpose. He was looking for Elian. The archivist was not at his workstation. Kalen had already confirmed he wasn't in his habitation pod either. He had vanished. A logical mind would assume he had been taken. But Kalen's instincts, the ones he was finally beginning to trust, told him otherwise. Elian had run. He had been smart enough to know that confinement was just a prelude to disappearance. Kalen stopped at Elian's console. It was wiped clean, all recent activity erased. But Elian was an archivist. He understood that true erasure was impossible. There were always fragments, echoes left in the deep code. Kalen accessed the terminal's core memory, bypassing the surface-level deletions. He found what he was looking for, the ghost of a data packet sent just hours ago. The encryption was complex, the work of a professional, but it bore the signature of Elian's parents, a style Kalen now recognized. He didn't have time to break it, but he could trace its destination vector, a defunct comms relay in the Undercity, Sector 4, a known dead zone, a perfect place for a clandestine meeting. He was about to leave when a flicker of light caught his eye. Tucked deep inside the console's ventilation slit was a tiny data chip, no bigger than his thumbnail. It was a deliberate act. Elian had left it for him. He knew Kalen would look deeper. He knew Kalen would find it. It was a test, a gamble. Kalen retrieved the chip and slotted it into his datapad. It contained a single, unencrypted audio file. He pressed play. Elian's voice filled the silence, not the clipped, fearful tones of the interrogation, but a quiet, steady whisper, laced with an exhaustion that went bone deep. "Detective," the voice began, and Kalen felt a strange jolt at the direct address. "If you are hearing this, it means you are not what you appear to be, or perhaps you are exactly what you appear to be, and this is a fatal miscalculation. Lyra trusted you. She said the consortium's best hunter was also its most honorable man. She believed you served order, not ambition." A pause. Kalen could hear the soft sound of Elian's breathing. "They killed her because of me. They want me. Project Chimera wasn't terminated. It was buried. I am the last piece of data they need to unearth it. I am a key, and they will kill anyone to get their hands on me. I will not be their specimen. I will not be their weapon. My parents died fighting them. Lyra died protecting me. I will not let their sacrifices be for nothing." The whisper grew stronger, infused with a sliver of steel. "I don't know what you are, Detective Valerius, a monster of the system, or a man trapped within it. But Lyra believed in you. And I am choosing to believe in her. This is my choice, not my fear." The recording ended. Kalen stood motionless, the quiet words echoing in the vast, empty space. "I don't know what you are." The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to his identity. He had been a tool, an asset, the perfect alpha enforcer. He was Kalen Valerius, son of the director, heir to a legacy of control. But Elian's message offered another possibility. A man trapped within the system. A man who could choose. He looked down at the datapad. Elian was not just a target anymore. He was a person, making a conscious choice, fighting back with the only weapons he had. Knowledge and a desperate, calculated trust. It was the most illogical, reckless thing Kalen had ever encountered, and it was the first thing that had felt truly real in years. He made his way to Sector 4, the Undercity. The sterile, ordered world of the spire gave way to a labyrinth of rusted pipes, dripping condensation, and the low hum of ancient machinery. The air here was thick, alive with the scent of humanity, of sweat, of spiced food, of decay and desperation. It was a chaotic symphony that would have overwhelmed a lesser alpha. But for Kalen, it was a relief from the sterile silence of the upper levels. He found the dead comms relay in a disused pumping station. The place was deserted. He was too late. But as he scanned the area, his senses picked up a trace scent beneath the layers of rust and grime, ozone and petrichor. Elian had been here, And he had not been alone. There was another scent, sharp and unfamiliar, of cybernetic fluid and scorched wiring. A fight, a struggle. He followed the faint trail deeper into the tunnels, his weapon drawn. The scent led him to a small, abandoned maintenance hub. The door was forced. Inside, the scene was one of chaos. Overturned crates, a discarded energy pack, still warm, and on the floor, a single drop of blood. Kalen knelt, analyzing the scent. It wasn't Elian's. It belonged to the other person, the one with the cybernetic scent. Jack's, he presumed, Elian's contact. But where was Elian? As he scanned the room, he saw it, scratched into the grimy surface of a metal panel, almost invisible in the dim light. A single symbol, a stylized bird in flight. It was the symbol from the locket, the symbol of sanctuary. It wasn't a sign of capture. It was a message, a destination. Elian had escaped his would-be captors and was heading for the only safe place he knew. But Kalen knew something Elian didn't. Sanctuary was a myth, a ghost story his parents had chased. It had never been found. It was a fool's hope. And now Elian was chasing it, alone and hunted. He was no longer just a variable in a case. He was a person in desperate need of protection. Kalen's duty was clear, but it was no longer to the consortium. It was to the man who had chosen to believe in him. He had to find him before his father's assassins did. He was now operating on the other side of the law, a traitor to the system he had sworn to uphold. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he felt a strange sense of liberation. The cage was broken. The leash was cut. For the first time, he was not the hunter. He was the guardian. And his charge smelled of thunderstorms. The Undercity was a wound in the belly of the metropolis, a place of shadows and secrets. Elian moved through its labyrinthine tunnels, a ghost among ghosts. The air was a thick, cloying soup of smells. Damp earth, unidentifiable chemicals, the press of too many bodies living in too little space. It was an assault on his senses, but it was also a camouflage. Here, his own faint, panicked scent was just one more note in a chaotic chorus. He had met Jax, his parents' old contact, at the pumping station. The man was a wiry cyborg, his face more metal than flesh, his scent a strange mix of ozone and old machine oil. He had confirmed Elian's fears. A kill squad from Special Sciences was in the Undercity, sweeping the sectors, their target unregistered and anomalous designations. They weren't consortium enforcers, they were his father's private army. They were hunting him. Jax had been arranging passage for him to an outer rim smuggling route when they were ambushed. The assassins were fast, silent, and clad in black tactical gear that absorbed the light. They moved like wraiths. Jax had fought back, creating a diversion, yelling at Elian to run, to follow the old markers to sanctuary. A searing blast from a plasma rifle had cut him down. Elian had run. Guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making each breath a ragged effort. Jax was dead. Lyra was dead. All because of him. The weight of their sacrifice was a fire in his veins, burning away the last of his fear, leaving a hard, cold resolve in its place. He would not let them die for nothing. He followed the markers, the faded symbols of a soaring bird his parents had left behind years ago, a breadcrumb trail to a promise. Sanctuary, a place of safety, of freedom, a myth he had to believe in, because it was all he had left. The tunnels grew deeper, more ancient. The sounds of the Undercity faded, replaced by the drip of water and the scuttling of unseen things. He was alone, pressing deeper into the city's forgotten foundations. It was then that he felt it. A shift in the air, a familiar, chilling presence. Cold iron and ice. Detective Valerius. Elian flattened himself into a dark alcove, his heart hammering against his ribs. How? How could he have found him? He held his breath, praying the darkness and the overwhelming sense of the tunnel would hide him. But he knew it was a futile hope. This alpha could smell a secret whispered a mile away. The soft, measured footsteps stopped just yards from his hiding place. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Elian could feel the detective's presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was being watched, hunted. Elian. The voice was quiet, yet it echoed in the narrow tunnel, a calm, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. It was not the voice of an enforcer making an arrest. It was something else. Elian remained silent, pressed into the shadows, his body rigid with tension. I received your message. Another pause. The footsteps resumed, closer this time. Your trust was unexpected. Elian's mind raced. Was this a trick, a psychological tactic to lure him out? They are not consortium, the detective's voice continued, closer still. He was just outside the alcove now. Elian could smell him, the scent of authority and cold control, a stark intrusion in the earthy dampness of the tunnel. They are a private unit controlled by my father, Director Valerius. He ran Project Chimera. He wants you back. The words were a quiet confession, an act of supreme treason. Elian's breath caught in his throat. This changed everything. Valerius was not hunting him for the consortium. He was warning him. Sanctuary is not real, the detective said, his voice now directly beside him. Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body. It was a concept, a hope your parents had. The markers lead to a dead end, a trap my father laid years ago. The hope that had been driving Elian forward crumbled into dust. A trap. Of course it was a trap. He had been a fool, chasing a child's story into the jaws of the beast. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. He had nowhere left to run. I am not here to detain you, Kalen said softly. He stepped into the alcove, his large frame filling the small space, plunging it into deeper shadow. He did not touch Elian, but his proximity was overwhelming. The alpha's scent was a physical presence, wrapping around him, short-circuiting his thoughts. It should have been terrifying, but strangely, it wasn't. The scent was still one of power, but the chilling edge was gone, replaced by something else. A steady, grounding note. The smell of winter earth, solid and protective. My father used me. He used the law to hunt you for his own purposes. I will not be his tool. This was the moment, the turning point. Elian had to make a choice, trust the monster who had hunted him or die alone in the dark. He looked up, finally meeting the detective's eyes. In the dim light, they were not the cold, analytical chips of ice he remembered from the interrogation room. They were dark, intense, and filled with a gravity that seemed to pull him in. He saw no deception there, only a stark, unyielding resolve. What do you want? Elian whispered, his voice hoarse. I want to offer you a new option, Kalen replied, his voice a low rumble. Not sanctuary, asylum. I have a place, a true ghost in the system. My father knows nothing of it. It will be safe, for a time. Why? The question was a breath, full of a decade of fear and suspicion. Why would you do this? It's treason. Kalen's gaze was unwavering. My entire service has been dedicated to a system of order. My father has perverted that system for personal gain. He has created chaos under the guise of control. You are the living proof of his corruption. Protecting you is not treason. It is a restoration of balance. It was a logical, clinical explanation. But Elian could smell the truth beneath the words. It was not just about balance or duty. There was something else, something personal and profound that the detective himself probably didn't understand. A resonance, a connection that defied logic. I have nowhere else to go, Elian admitted, the words a surrender and a plea. For the first time, Kalen moved. He reached out, not to grab or restrain, but slowly, his hand open. He hesitated for a moment, then gently brushed a stray strand of hair from Elian's forehead. The touch was brief, a ghost of warmth against his cold skin, but it sent a shockwave through Elian's system. It was the first gentle touch he had felt in years, and it shattered the last of his resistance. "Come with me," Kalen said. It was not an order, it was an invitation. Elian took a shaky breath, the sense of the tunnel, of fear, of the alpha before him, swirling into a dizzying vortex. He had spent his life running, hiding, being a ghost. Now he was stepping out of the shadows and placing his life in the hands of his hunter. He gave a single, sharp nod, and for the first time, he followed. The safe house was an anomaly, a forgotten pocket of reality tucked behind a crumbling facade in the oldest part of the city, a sector long ago scheduled for demolition, but perpetually ignored. It had been his mother's, Kalen explained, a relic from a time before his father's influence had become absolute, a place off the consortium's grid entirely. Inside, it was not the sterile, functional space Kalen's own apartment had been. It was filled with old physical books, their paper scent a warm and welcoming aroma. There were soft textiles, worn wooden furniture, and a single large window that looked out not onto the glittering city, but onto a small, overgrown courtyard, a patch of defiant green in a world of concrete and steel. It was the first place Elian had been in years that felt truly alive. But safety was a fragile illusion. The moment the heavy door sealed behind them, shutting out the city, the adrenaline that had been fueling Elian for days vanished, leaving a profound, shaking exhaustion in its wake. The emergency suppressant he had taken was wearing off, its chemical dam crumbling against the tide of his own biology. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he stumbled, his legs refusing to hold him. Kalen caught him, his arm wrapping around Elian's waist with a steady, impersonal strength. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low. He guided Elian to a worn sofa, the fabric soft beneath his trembling fingers. The brief contact sent another jolt through Elian, his skin tingling where the alpha had touched him. His system, starved of any positive stimulus for so long, was overreacting to everything. Kalen kept a respectful distance, standing by the window, his back to Elian, granting him a moment to compose himself. But Elian's composure was gone. A deep, shuddering tremor started in his core and spread through his limbs. The air around him began to shimmer, to thicken with a scent he had not released in over a decade. It was sweet, achingly so, with the sharp, clean undertone of ozone. It was the scent of an omega in distress, on the verge of a long, suppressed heat. Panic seized him. "No," he whispered, a denial against his own body. Not now. He tried to fight it, to force it back down with sheer will, but his fortress was in ruins. The stress, the fear, the grief, and now the overwhelming proximity of a powerful, protective alpha. It was a perfect storm, and it was tearing him apart. The scent flooded the room, thick and potent, a pheromonal siren's call. It was a smell of desperate vulnerability, of need, of a pain that was both physical and emotional. It was the scent of his deepest, most secret self, laid bare for the first time. Kalen turned slowly from the window. His face was a mask of control, but Elian could see the subtle flare of his nostrils, the tension in his jaw. The scent was hitting him, a biological imperative that no amount of training could fully ignore. An alpha's instinct, when faced with an omega in heat, was singular: to claim, to bond, to dominate. Elian squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable, for the monster to finally emerge. He would be a thing to be used, a biological urge to be sated. It was the fate he had run from his entire life, but the lunge never came. Instead, Kalen's movements were slow, deliberate. He walked to a small kitchenette, his steps measured. He opened a cabinet, his back still to Elian. The sound of running water filled the silence, then the click of a med kit. When he turned back, he held a glass of water and 2 nutrient packs. He approached the sofa cautiously, as if approaching a frightened animal. He knelt before Elian, placing the items on the low table. He did not look at Elian's face, but at his hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists in his lap. "Your system is in shock," Kalen said, his voice quiet, steady, a lifeline in the storm of Elian's senses. "Your suppressants have failed. This is a biological response to extreme, prolonged stress." His tone was clinical, the voice of a doctor, not a predator. It was so contrary to what Elian expected that it broke through his panic. He opened his eyes. Kalen was still kneeling, his gaze level. The air was thick with Elian's scent, a potent aphrodisiac that should have driven any alpha into a frenzy. Kalen was visibly fighting its effects, a fine sheen of sweat on his brow, the muscles in his neck corded with tension. But he was fighting. He was choosing control. He was not succumbing. "I am not going to hurt you, Elian," he said, and his use of Elian's name was a grounding force. "Your scent, it is potent, but I will not act on it. You have my word." A wave of heat washed through Elian's body, a painful cramp seizing his abdomen. He gasped, curling in on himself. This was it, the beginning. Kalen moved with surprising speed. He went to the small sanitation unit and returned with a cloth soaked in cool water. He gently placed it on Elian's forehead. The coolness was a shock, a small point of relief in a sea of fire. "Breathe," Kalen instructed, his voice a low command, not of dominance, but of guidance. "Focus on my voice. Match your breathing to mine." He began to inhale and exhale in a slow, deep rhythm. Elian tried to follow, his own breaths ragged and shallow. Inhale, the scent of iron and winter earth. Exhale, the scent of his own cloying sweetness. Little by little, the rhythm took hold. The frantic terror in his chest began to subside, replaced by a vast, aching vulnerability. Tears started to stream from his eyes, silent and hot. He was not crying from fear, but from a decade of repressed pain and loneliness. He was falling apart, and for the first time, someone was there to witness it. Not to take advantage, but to simply be there. Kalen did not speak. He just knelt there, a steady, silent presence, his scent a wall against the chaos, his rhythmic breathing a metronome for Elian's shattered senses. He was not being dominated. He was being protected. He was not being claimed. He was being seen. In the depths of his biological surrender, in the heart of his greatest vulnerability, Elian felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation begin to bloom in his chest. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. It was trust. The heat would be days of agony, a fever of the body and soul. But as he looked at the Alpha who knelt before him, a man who was actively choosing reason over instinct, honor over biology, he knew, with a certainty that cut through the pain, that he would not be going through it alone. The fever came and went in waves, a relentless tide of heat and pain that stripped away every layer of Elian's control, leaving him raw and exposed. Time lost its meaning, dissolving into a blur of sweat-soaked sheets, aching muscles, and the hallucinatory potency of his own scent. The small safe house became a crucible, the air thick with the smell of his distress, a scent so powerful it felt like a physical entity in the room. Through it all, Kalen was a constant, steady presence. He was a guardian, a caretaker, his actions defined by a clinical yet profound tenderness that defied every instinct Elian had about alphas. He brought water a nutrient broth, his movements economical and precise. He changed the cool cloths on Elian's forehead, his touch brief and impersonal, yet it was an anchor in the swirling chaos of the fever. He never spoke unless necessary, his silence a respectful acknowledgement of Elian's agony. He slept on the floor by the sofa, a silent sentinel, his large frame a dark, protective shape in the dim light. For Kalen, it was a battle of a different kind. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against his father's assassins who were undoubtedly scouring the city for them, and against his own primal biology. Elian's scent was a constant, insidious assault on his senses. It was designed by nature to bypass logic, to trigger an alpha's most basic, possessive instincts. It filled his lungs, coated his tongue, and whispered directly to the core of his DNA. It demanded a response. It demanded he claim the suffering Omega, mark him, bond with him, end his pain through the most intimate act of dominance. Every moment was a test of his will, a testament to a lifetime of disciplined control. He meditated, focusing his mind on tactical problems, on the patterns of his father's strategies, on anything to distract from the sweet, agonizing scent of rain and blooming nightshade that permeated everything. He was not an animal. He was not his father's son. He would not be ruled by instinct. It was during the third cycle, when the fever was at its peak, that Elian's delirium broke through. His eyes, glassy with pain, focused on Kalen. "They took them," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "In the night, I smelled the ozone from their weapons." Kalen sat on the floor beside him, his expression unreadable. "Your parents," he stated, his voice soft. It was not a question. Elian nodded, a tear tracing a path through the sweat on his temple. "They made me hide in the scent-proof cabinet. They told me not to make a sound. I was so small. I watched through the crack in the door. They didn't fight. They just went to protect me." The confession came out in a torrent of broken phrases, a memory buried for 17 years, now unearthed by the fever. "My father. He signed the order," Kalen said, the words costing him something. It was a confession of his own. He listed them as a recalibrated. I read the file. I thought it was just part of his job. Elian's gaze cleared for a moment, a flash of lucidity in the feverish haze. He looked at Kalen, truly looked at him, and saw not the enforcer, not the son of his enemy, but another victim of the same system. A man raised in a cage of duty, just as Elian had been raised in a cage of fear. "He made you a weapon," Elian whispered, "and me a secret." The parallel hung in the air between them, a stark, undeniable truth. two sides of the same corrupt coin, forged in the same fire. The fever subsided into a restless sleep, but the confession lingered. The dynamic between them had shifted. They were no longer just a protector and his charge. They were two survivors, bound by a shared enemy and a shared, tragic history. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Elian woke to a world that was quiet and still. The oppressive heat was gone, replaced by a clean, aching exhaustion. The scent in the room was muted, the cloying sweetness replaced by the faint, clean smell of petrichor, his own true, calm scent finally emerging. Kalen was asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted back, his face relaxed in a way Elian had never seen. The mask of control was gone, revealing a man who looked weary, burdened. In sleep, he was not the formidable detective, but just Kalen, a man who had fought a silent, brutal war for 4 days and won. Elian sat up slowly, his body weak but his own again. He looked at his hands, no longer trembling. He took a deep breath, and for the first time he did not smell fear. He smelled the scent of old books, of the damp earth from the courtyard, and the faint, steady scent of the sleeping alpha, iron and winter soil. It was no longer threatening. It was comforting. He stood, his legs shaky, and found a blanket. He walked over to Kalen and gently draped it over him. The alpha stirred, but didn't wake. His proximity no longer sent a jolt of panic through Elian. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude that was so profound it almost brought him to tears again. This man had saved him, not just from his father's assassins, but from himself. He had stood guard over his deepest vulnerability and had not flinched, had not taken. He had simply held the space. He was not a monster. He was not a tool. He was Kalen. Elian went to the small kitchen and found the nutrient packs. He prepared one for Kalen and one for himself. When Kalen finally woke, the first thing he saw was Elian, sitting at the small table, a cup of nutrient broth waiting for him. Elian offered him a small, hesitant smile. It was the first time Kalen had seen him smile. It transformed his face, chasing the shadows from his stormy eyes. "Thank you," Elian said, his voice quiet but clear. Kalen simply nodded, accepting the broth. The silence between them was no longer tense or fraught with unspoken things. It was calm, companionable. They had been through the fire together and had emerged on the other side, changed. "What now?" Elian asked, breaking the silence. Kalen looked out the window at the defiant patch of green in the courtyard. "Now," he said, his voice resonating with a new, hard-won purpose. "We dismantle the system that created us." He was not a detective. He was a rebel. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. The thought was a quiet revelation, a seed of identity taking root in soil that had been barren for years. He looked at Kalen, the alpha who had shown him that control could be a form of protection, not just oppression, and for the first time he saw not a future of running, but a future of fighting, and he would not be fighting alone. The safe house became their war room. The quiet sanctuary transformed into the epicenter of a silent rebellion. Kalen, with his intimate knowledge of the consortium's digital infrastructure, became the architect of their strategy. Elian, with his archivist's mind and the recovered data from Lyra's files, became the keeper of their truth. They worked in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, two minds moving as one. Kalen would identify a weakness in the network, a vulnerability in a data fortress, and Elian would provide the historical context, the forgotten file, the buried secret that could be used as a key. They spoke in low tones, their heads bent over a holographic display that cast a blue glow on their faces. The formality that had once defined their interactions had evaporated, replaced by a comfortable intimacy forged in the crucible of Elian's fever. They were no longer Alpha and Omega, enforcer and fugitive. They were Kalen and Elian, partners. "My father's power is built on a lie," Kalen explained, his finger tracing a line through a complex diagram of the consortium's power structure. "The lie is that designations are stable, that the system is perfect. Project Chimera proves it isn't. They weren't just weaponizing Omegas. They were trying to create them, to alter betas, even alphas. The project was a failure, resulting in genetic instability, psychosis, death. Your parents discovered the truth and were silenced for it. And I am the one success," Elian finished, his voice flat. "The one stable subject with the resonant marker. That's why he wants me so badly. I'm not just a loose end. I'm the proof of concept he needs to restart his work." "He won't get you," Kalen stated, his voice a low, absolute promise. His gaze met Elian's, and in that look, Elian saw an unwavering conviction that settled the last of his fears. Their plan was audacious. They would not just run. They would not just hide. They would detonate the truth at the heart of the consortium. They would leak the entirety of the Project Chimera files, the unethical experiments, the list of the dead, the cover-up, and his father's direct involvement to every terminal in the city. They would expose the lie. It was a suicide mission. The moment they initiated the data burst, their location would be compromised. They would have minutes, at most, to escape before the full force of the director's wrath descended upon them. As the days passed, a new routine settled over them. In the quiet moments between their work, they would talk. Elian spoke of his parents, not as martyred dissidents, but as people. He remembered the smell of the rare herbs his mother grew in their small hydroponics bay, the sound of his father humming off-key while he worked. Kalen, in turn, spoke of his own past, a childhood of rigorous training schedules, of emotional suppression, of a constant crushing pressure to be the perfect alpha, the perfect heir. His father was a cold, demanding architect of his life. His mother, a distant, fragile woman who had retreated into herself long ago. It was her safe house, her one act of defiance, a secret she had passed to her son before she died. They were two lonely boys, raised by ghosts and ideologies, who had found an unexpected solace in each other's company. One evening, as they worked, Kalen paused. "Your scent," he said, his voice quiet. Elian tensed instinctively, a relic of old fear. "It has changed." "Changed how?" "Before, in the archive, it was sharp, caged, all fear and defiance. Now," he trailed off, searching for the word, "it's calm, like the air after a storm has passed." Elian felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He had spent his life trying to smell of nothing. Now this alpha, his former hunter, was learning the nuances of his scent, reading it not as a threat or a lure, but as an extension of his emotional state. He was being understood in a way he had never thought possible. "Your scent has changed too," Elian found himself saying, his voice soft. Kalen looked at him, his dark eyes questioning. In the interrogation room, it was all ice and iron. Absolute control. Now, there's something else. Beneath the control. It smells solid, like the earth. A flicker of surprise. Then something warmer passed through Kalen's expression. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. It was the first time Elian had seen him truly smile, and it was a revelation. The final day arrived. The code was written. The data packet was ready. Their escape route was planned, a treacherous path through the city's deepest, most forgotten tunnels. There was nothing left to do but wait for the appointed time, a citywide system diagnostic that would provide the perfect window for their data burst. The tension in the small apartment was a palpable thing. They sat in silence, the weight of what they were about to do settling over them. This was the point of no return. Elian found his hands were trembling again. He looked at Kalen, who was staring out the window at the small green courtyard, his face grim. He looked like a general on the eve of a battle he knew he might not survive. Without thinking, Elian reached out and placed his hand over Kalen's, where it rested on the table. Kalen's hand was large and warm. He flinched at the unexpected contact, then relaxed, turning his hand over to lace his fingers with Elian's. The contact was electric, a current of silent communication passing between them. It was not a gesture of romance, but of solidarity, of partnership, of two solitary souls facing the abyss together. "I am afraid," Elian admitted, the words a quiet whisper in the stillness. "So am I," Kalen confessed, his thumb stroking the back of Elian's hand. It was a simple, profound admission of vulnerability from a man who had been trained to have none. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped together, drawing strength from each other's presence. The storm was coming, but this time they would face it together. They were not just dismantling a system. They were building something new in its place, something forged in trust and defiance in a small, hidden room, with the scent of petrichor and winter earth mingling in the quiet air.